Hello and welcome to the Life After Diets podcast. I'm Sarah Dosanjh, psychotherapist and author of the book, I Can't Stop Eating.
And I'm Stefanie Michele, binge recovery health coach. If you feel out of control around food, we get it because we've been there.
Thank you for joining our conversations about how to make peace with food and feel more comfortable in our bodies.
Now on to this week's episode.
Can I begin this episode with the most British intro possible?
Yeah.
And talk about the weather for a moment.
Is that what you do over there?
Well, it's a stereotype, isn't it? British people talk about the weather, but it is freezing. It's -4 in London, which is quite unusual for us to have freezing temperatures like that. You know, I hate the cold.
Yes, me too.
The cold can make me feel quite emotional and sad. But it's at that point where, because everyone's talking about it, it's kind of fun. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, like it's a way you're all bonding together.
Yeah, like with a heat wave. Extremes. I quite like extremes. I don't know what that says about me.
I get it.
Extremes. Yeah.
I get it. Yeah, I think it's a bonding thing. It's like we're all talking about it. We're all experiencing this thing together.
Yeah.
We're all hunkering down in the cold.
Yeah. So what are your winter cozies though? What makes you feel cozy at wintertime?
Well, right now here it's snowing today, and I just looked at the weather, and we're supposed to get quite a snowstorm for Christmas. So like snow falling, like when my kids are off school, when they call school off, to me that is the best feeling, even though when I think about it logically, it's not. But there's something that still persists around that idea. It's so cozy when we're all going to be in our pajamas all day, drinking hot chocolate, sledding outside. I hate sledding, but the idea of the whole thing is very comforting and cozy to me.
Mm-hmm. I'm really enjoying this chamomile and lavender tea.
Why are you laughing?
I don't know. You're talking about sledding and snow, and I'm like, I'm really liking this tea.
That's British.
So that is making me feel really cozy at the moment. And I have this lavender and I can't remember what the other thing is, pillow spray, which I'm really enjoying at night. I just feel enveloped into this scent. And I have an extra duvet on the bed and hot water bottles, electric blankets, all of that. So there are all these ways that I'm enjoying making my own warmth in these cold times.
I think that's a great thing to highlight.
So speaking of cold weather, our guest today is on to talk about ADHD.
Good segue, Sarah. That was very connecting. Yes, Becca King. She is known as the ADHD Nutritionist on social media, and she comes to join us to talk about the intersection of food, not just binge eating, but also her experience with anorexia in the past and the neurodivergent brain in the form of ADHD. I'd also like to mention that, after recording this episode, I think it can be really tempting to self-diagnose when you hear some of the things that she'll talk about. I know that somebody who
I saw
heard, yeah, where was that on? How did that come up?
It was a YouTube comment, and somebody suggested that you might have ADHD.
Yes. And I was like, oh, I thought so too when I talked to Becca. And then oddly, because the algorithm sends you what you need to know. I saw another post about somebody who had just recently been to their doctor and discovered that they don't actually have ADHD, but they have an anxiety that reaches levels that mimic ADHD. So I just wanted to point out that while you may find yourself relating to some of the things Becca is talking about, there are other intersections of some of these symptoms with other conditions or just being human.
And I don't know if I ever told you, but when I did a video on my YouTube channel about ADHD, and that was an interview, someone put in the comments, I think the host needs to get tested for ADHD.
We've all got a touch.
I also haven't been called the host before, so it was obviously someone who wasn't really following my stuff. But I think there's two sides to this. One, exactly what you say, Steph. It can be tempting to diagnose yourself off the back of a podcast, off the back of hearing some information about it. But also, as part of that as well, I think a lot of this stuff is really relatable, even if you don't have diagnosable ADHD. A lot of these conversations around dopamine chasing and that dopamine seeking behavior, I think many of us can relate to and impacted by. So even if you're someone who's pretty sure you're not on the ADHD spectrum, I think you might find this episode useful. I'll let you decide if you just want to
listen till the end and then decide.
Yeah, decide there. All right, everyone. See you on the other side. No, why did I say that? No. We can do that. We just cut at the side.
Okay.
Done.
Okay, great.
I'm very excited about today's episode because I think this is a really important subject that has been coming up more and more frequently. I don't know if you've been seeing something similar, Steph, with your clients.
Huge. Yes. I'm sitting here trying to contain myself because I have so many questions and I want to talk about this intersection so much. And I really want to learn more about it as well. So yeah, we should probably introduce Becca.
Well, I've introduced her a bit in the introduction, but we'll let her speak though, shall we?
Yeah.
Yeah, why not?
I'm Becca. I'm super excited to chat with you guys. I think learning more about like the connection between eating challenges and ADHD is super helpful, especially as more women are getting diagnosed. Now, I think there's a lot more people making that connection and wanting to figure out how to manage things a little bit better. So,
Yeah. And it's different. I started this work several years ago without the lens of ADHD. And what I was finding was that the clients who some clients actually I didn't have a diagnosis, and I was like kept running into some kind of like the approach is just not hitting the same, and there's something missing here. And I didn't know, like, and I was just like, I knew there was something off, but I didn't know what to do about it. And the more I learned about ADHD, which my brother has, so I knew I was familiar to an extent. But when I started following accounts like yours and seeing, I was like, okay, there's something here that's getting missed in mainstream discussion, even anti-diet, non-diet approach discussion about with this intersection. And I started paying attention to that. And that was one of those times where I was like, oh, now I know what I don't know.
yeah.
And that's important. So I've referred a lot out, and where I'm seeing clients with a similar pattern, and some of them are getting evaluated for it and come back and say, yeah, like this is something that I'm dealing with and I never knew. And I'm like, okay, that makes sense as to why the approach is a bit different, and it's not always discussed, and it's not just the same necessarily the same approaches as it would be for somebody who doesn't deal with that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think I like thinking about even like the intuitive eating framework as a framework and being able to adapt it with my clients, because some of the just eat when you're hungry, like obviously there's a lot of nuance to honoring your hunger and that principle. But on the surface for people, if you're just reading the book, it's not from a neurodivergent lens. So then people are like, well, I can't do that. That's impossible. Or I'll get people to be like, well, if I just listen to my body, I won't eat all day and then I'll binge at night, because that's just how, like, I don't feel hungry during the day, even if they're not medicated. And so I think being able to approach it and adapt it for people, and that might mean like using more external tools and things that might not feel intuitive to some people, but just we need them. As like as someone who has ADHD, I need other external things to help me remember to do other things outside of just eating too. And that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with my brain. It's just that I need other things to kind of make my day-to-day life a little bit easier.
How did you end up getting diagnosed, Becca? Was this in your adulthood you were diagnosed?
Yeah, I got diagnosed at 19. So I feel like I have a quote unquote a typical story for a lot of females with ADHD, where like I did really well in school. I was super active. My mom kept me busy all the time. And then I got to college, and my freshman year, I could not function. Like I couldn't figure out how to study or keep my dorm clean. Everything felt super hard, and it was just like I don't know how to do all the things I'm supposed to do as a young adult. And my roommate, and she's not now my best friend, she has ADHD, and we were just like two peas in a pod. And by my sophomore year, when I was seeing a therapist, I was like, I think I have ADHD. I just checked all the boxes for it. And so she was like, yeah, we'll evaluate you. And that's how I got diagnosed. It can be a little bit different. Some people will see like an attention specialist or something like that, or work with a psychologist to do more in-depth testing. I just did more like a paper test. Stefanie, what you said earlier, where it was like, there's just something missing here. That's like how I felt before I got diagnosed. There's just something off. I do things differently. I think different. I could just tell. And then once I got diagnosed, I was like, oh, this makes a lot more sense.
It's interesting because I had a client who said, I can't possibly have ADHD. I did really well in high school. And it's so interesting that you just brought that up, because I think sometimes that's a misconception, or maybe it can be. I think when my brother didn't do well in school, like that was sort of more a classic. And I think is that a stereotype?
And I'd say that's where like kind of the gender difference comes in a little bit, is like girls tend to be a lot more people pleasers or more prone to masking because it's more socially acceptable for a boy to be hyperactive or to be like have an attitude or be a little defiant and all of that sort of stuff. It's not like as socially acceptable. So females tend to be more likely to like mask their symptoms and try to hide that there's something else going on. So they're more likely to people please or seek out like approval from their teachers. And that's how they'll try really hard to do well in school. And like looking back, I had to try really, really hard and I did well, but it was not by any means easy, or like I needed tutors and things like that to kind of help support me along the way.
Okay. Can you speak to some of the symptoms that someone would be looking out for, just for anyone listening who isn't familiar with this as a diagnosis?
Yeah. So there's 3 different types of ADHD. So there used to be ADD, like attention deficit disorder, and ADHD. And then they got rid of ADD and just have ADHD. And then there's 3 types. So there's hyperactive, impulsive type, the inattentive type, and then a combined type. So if you're combined, you have at least 6, I believe it is, of the 9 symptoms from each of the other 2 categories. So inattentive would be like someone who, they might be more prone to like daydreaming or being easily distracted kind of thing. They might forget things a lot. Someone who's hyperactive, you don't really think of like that little boy who can't sit still in their chair. But it can also, especially for females, present more as mental hyperactivity. So it might be like, oh, I'm sitting here and you might look like nothing is going on, but in your brain, there's 50 thoughts going on here. No, there's a lot going on. It just doesn't look like it externally. Other things I would say thinking about is executive dysfunction, struggling with initiating tasks, changing tasks, finishing tasks, especially on time, or being late to everything, even though you might try really hard to be on time, forgetting things. And I'd say too that because everyone, there's always like that, but everyone has a little bit of ADHD now. These symptoms, like there's no light switch on and off. You might have some better days, but there isn't just like, oh, occasionally this happens. It's like a constant thing that pops up on a very, very regular basis.
I hear that a lot with people criticizing ADHD diagnosis. So I've had people say, I think I might have some of these symptoms, but it feels like an excuse. And this idea of it being an excuse seems to be a block for people to figure out something that might genuinely be going on.
Yeah. I think I've even felt that a little bit just because of the stigma of it. Of like, maybe I don't really have this, or like I'm just coming up with a reason why I struggle to get things done or keep my apartment clean or whatever. But I think sometimes you can do really well for a period of time. Like a lot of women don't often get diagnosed until perimenopause or menopause. There is a hormonal component to ADHD with estrogen is kind of linked to dopamine, and ADHD brains are low in dopamine. So when we get to perimenopause and menopause and our estrogen levels drop, dopamine drops. And so for a lot of women, they're like, I do really, really well. And then all of a sudden I can't function and can't do any of the things. All of my coping mechanisms in my day-to-day life have completely gone out the window. And they're like, I don't understand what's going on. So I think it's important.
Oh, wow. And also the impulsive. Did you speak to the impulsive type? Because that's how I see it intersecting with food a lot. But I was going to ask, how does this intersect, or how did it intersect for you? How does it intersect for most people around food?
So I think there's a couple things. The impulsivity piece can be really hard of like, ooh, I see something, I want it. Having low interoception is very common amongst ADHDers. So we often don't recognize body cues until they're screaming at us. Even like going to the bathroom, you might not notice until like you have to run to the bathroom, or you might just like push it off because you're like, I need to finish what I'm working on. And my clients will do the same thing with hunger, where they're like, let me finish this email and then I'll eat. And then, 3 hours go by and they're ravenous. And then by the time they eat, of course, they want the quickest, fastest thing. And they're, excessively hungry. So like, oh, I'm picking things to eat that I wouldn't pick if I wasn't ravenous. And they're things that don't make me feel good. They're like, I know this isn't going to make me feel good, but I'm just going to grab this bag of chips and I eat it really quickly. And then I'm like, I didn't even want to do that kind of mentality. So that can happen. And the executive function piece too of cooking, like there's a lot of steps in being able to decide what to eat, to get the ingredients, to prep the ingredients, to cook it, to eating it, and then cleaning everything up. There's a lot involved in that process. So if cooking isn't something you enjoy, it can feel really overwhelming and exhausting. And so it can be hard to, prepare things, to keep up with things. A lot of my clients will spend a lot of money on takeout, even though they don't want to, but it's just like what feels most accessible to them. So.
And Becca, you've had your own lived experience of eating disorders.
Yes.
And do you want to share a little bit about that for our listeners?
I would say binge eating and bulimia are the most common amongst ADHDers, or where the research really shows there's a really strong correlation with ADHD. For me, when I was in high school, I had moved and my world felt chaotic and I wasn't diagnosed with ADHD yet. And I just remember telling myself, I can't control anything right now. So why don't I control what I eat? And it just became a hyperfixation for me, was like perfecting my eating, which just went down a road towards anorexia. And then when I got to college, I started to eat more and the pendulum kind of swung the other way, but I didn't get enough support. So I didn't really learn how to eat properly. So it kind of just swung from being anorexic to binge eating. And then when I got medicated, which was amazing at first, I definitely wouldn't eat enough during the day, and kind of what I call the ADHD binge restrict cycle, where you don't eat enough, or for some people don't eat at all during the day. And then when your meds wear off in the evening, you're ravenous, and then you binge. And I know that's still a common cycle for other people too, who don't have ADHD, but it's kind of like a very, very regular thing with my clients. And it wasn't really till the end of my undergrad until I got in grad school where I discovered intuitive eating. And at first I was like, this is so woo-woo. You cannot listen to your body. What are all these dietitians on Instagram talking about? And then I was like, I tried every other crazy diet and thing out there. None of it's working, and it's only made the binge eating worse at this point. And I was like, I'm going to give this a try. And then it kind of clicked, but there was definitely moments with intuitive eating where I was like, how does this work if I take medication that suppresses my appetite, and things like that, where I started to learn how to adapt it for myself to make it work, I guess.
And did you figure that out on your own through trial and error?
Yeah. I mean, I think being in grad school for nutrition, obviously most of my day revolved around learning about nutrition. And so I think the education piece of grad school is really helpful with my recovery of, learning what I'm doing to my body when I binge or I don't eat all day, and how not helpful that is for my well-being. It was really helpful with, I don't know, for me, the information side of things was like, okay, I can't be doing this to my body. And that really helped me kind of work through some of it. And then it was just a lot of figuring out, what meals and snacks and things I can eat. So I call it the hunger monster that comes out in the evening, to keep that hunger monster away.
Do you find that there's a component of, when you were talking earlier about the hyperactivity, that maybe, show itself through the body, but also that can exist through the mind? And what I see a lot in my female clients is that it's very difficult to get the thoughts to quiet down. And there's a thought of am I restricting? Am I not? Maybe I should eat it because I'm restricting. And it becomes I have a client who feels like a slave to that, and can't. And also the difficulty being that this happens at night when she can't take, when the meds have worn off and you can't sleep, but you can't take. And how do you manage that?
Yeah. So a big piece of it is, again, going back to that dopamine thing that I talked about. ADHD brains are lower in dopamine. And so we're always seeking out dopamine. So that's why people stim, fidget or do things like that, as a way to kind of stimulate your brain a little bit. And so when your medication wears off, the medication is providing you that dopamine during the day. So when it wears off, finding other things you can do as well. I was talking to my clients about creating a toolkit of other things you can do, because I know a lot of my clients, I sit down in front of the TV at night and they're like, I've already eaten. I have had a full day of meals. I know I'm genuinely not hungry. I just need something to do while I'm watching my show. So I don't just sit there and eat, but then I tune out. And then before I know it, I've eaten, a whole thing of ice cream or Oreos or whatever. And I haven't don't barely even remember doing it. And so I always like to talk about other things you can do, while you're watching TV or doing other things to kind of help give your brain that stimulation. If I'm genuinely not hungry, not in a restrictive sense. If you are hungry, by all means eat. When we talk about coping with your emotions and intuitive eating, of giving yourself permission to eat for stimulation as well, just trying to be more mindful about it when you do choose to do it.
Mm. So I've worked with a few people who have had ADHD diagnosis as adults.
Yeah.
And when they've got the diagnosis, and a few of them are self-diagnosed, and sometimes people have had professional diagnosis, there's this initial relief where it's like, oh, now so much makes sense.
Yes.
And then there's this, I don't want to use the word despair, but there's this stuck point. Well, what does that mean now? Because if this is a neurodivergent thing, which it is, I don't mean to say if, then I can't change it. There's no cure for ADHD as well. And quite a few people, for different reasons, choose not to medicate. So there can be a sense of, well, am I stuck? And
Yeah.
the other thing as well, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on this, because with something like, if we took binge eating, for example, someone once asked, recently someone asked me, what do you think causes binge eating? And I said, there's probably like 22 reasons. And they said, really? So I managed to reel off 18 anyway. And neurodivergency and ADHD was in there as well. But is there a risk then that people are saying, all my disordered eating down to ADHD, and then missing all the other complexities of what might be going on as well?
I try really hard to remind people that ADHD could be one component of what's causing you to binge eat. I think we unfortunately have all added layers of like, we have all the diet culture stuff. We have everything else that everyone else is subjected to in society that can, trigger us to engage in disordered eating behaviors. Like we have all that, and then adding ADHD on top of it, kind of how I like to think of it. Cause it's like, we're not like somehow magically don't have to deal with all of diet culture and all of that. It's still there, and we're still very much subjected to it as well.
That brings up feelings of like having compassion for yourself to be, it's hard enough just dealing with the diet culture pieces, and then this added layer, it just can make it so difficult. And I posted yesterday something about the way that intuitive eating, for example, and this famous might look different, is that like I think it tends to take more time to sort of figure this all out, and the timeline of recovery might look so different for people in this population, because there is so much more to be managing.
And then it's very interesting too that they're with like anti-fat bias and ableism, there's like a huge intersection between the two of those. And so for folks with ADHD, like unfortunately too, if you are in a larger body, or just neurodivergent in general, and you are in a larger body, you might be more subjected more to ableism and all of that. Oh, you're just lazy and you just don't try hard enough, and all of that type of messaging. And so it's very interesting to see how those two kind of intersect.
This idea of impulsivity, I think, is what frustrates people a lot, because there's the regret later, the impulsive eating or whatever the impulsivity may be around. Is there a way of reducing, or how do you manage the impulsivity part of ADHD? Yeah.
I think the biggest piece is making sure that you're fed regularly, because if you're going really long periods of time without eating, when you do eat, you might pick the thing that you like, again, going back to what I said earlier, like you might decide to eat potato chips as a snack when like you probably need to eat an actual meal. Like if you haven't eaten in 5 hours, you probably need a meal, and like a whole bag of potato chips is probably not what's going to feel good, but it's what's the most accessible thing or the easiest thing in the moment. So I find when I enabling my clients more fed regularly, that really helps. And then just kind of working through slowing down a little bit, which does take a little bit of time. And I think working too with like someone else, like a therapist or an ADHD coach too, on other skills can kind of help slow things down so you're not as impulsive. Like I'm super impulsive, especially with shopping. If I had a credit card with no limit, it would be very dangerous for me. And so it's like one of those things that like I've had to learn over time, different things that help me slow down so I don't buy things or, eat things that I don't, maybe don't actually want to eat, not in a restrictive way, but like, hey, you don't need to eat again. Like, hey, we should slow down and think through like, am I hungry for a meal, or am I hungry for a snack? What foods are going to feel good to me right now? So I think having my clients a lot of time to practice just checking in with themselves throughout the day really helps them too a little bit with impulsivity.
It reminds me of we've talked, I mean, I have anxiety, and I always talk about my nervous system. It's like very hyper, like I don't have ADHD to my knowledge, but it's like I'm very,
Yeah.
like, and the slowing down. I mean, there is this nervous system component in all of this where it's like there's such it's confusing and overwhelming to be moving so fast, and things just happen, and it's such an art and a practice, and it's hard to slow down what is by default trying to move really, really fast. And that can take so long. It's not just a matter of slow down. It's like, okay, like how?
And I feel like where mindfulness practices can be learning them outside of just food too. Like there is research with ADHD that mindfulness practices can be really helpful. And I think it's a good way to have experiences of being able to slow down or feel more regulated with your nervous system. And then you can start having those moments. I know for me with meditation, it was really helpful with being able to learn how to slow down a little bit and not have to just go, because that's usually when that impulsivity will happen.
Do you know where you would direct somebody who really struggles to slow down through ADHD to start? Because I know some people I know have got ADHD. If they even mention the word meditation, they'll just say, well, my brain doesn't do that. Is there a way or a technique or somewhere that's quite ADHD friendly, for want of a better word?
I'll have to find, there's an ADHD coach. I'll have to find her video and I can share it. You guys can add it in the show notes. She does a little video about meditation and like the different forms of meditation. And I just really appreciated it because I think a lot of people just think of it as like, we're just sitting there in silence and meditating. And I can do that to some degree. For me, even just going for a walk in nature and breathing and taking in the surroundings is meditative for me and really helpful. And so I think there can be different ways to meditate that don't always just have to be sitting in silence or even doing guided meditations when I first started. And I did them for very short periods, 5 minutes to start, because that way it was easier and I had someone guiding me through it. So that helped me versus just sit there and think that my brain was all over the place, but having someone kind of walk me through it and tell me where I should be connecting with in my body and focusing on my breath and like really helping me, and just learning that knowing that meditation does not mean you're not going to have any thoughts. That was really helpful for me to learn because I thought the same thing. If I can't meditate, that's out. My brain doesn't shut off. There's no way I can do that. Once I did Headspace for a little while, and it was really helpful for them to be like, hey, it's not about not having thoughts. It's just about being able to redirect your thoughts back to your, back to your breathing or whatever when you're meditating. So that was really helpful for me. It's like, oh, phew, I can actually do this.
If you want connection and support around any of the topics we talk about on the podcast, we would love for you to join our membership community.
Members have access to monthly online support groups, a private Facebook group, live episode recordings, and member-only Q&As.
If you would like to join us, please head to lifeafterdietspodcast.com/community.
Now let's get back to the episode.
So we had a couple of questions submitted from the community, which I'd be interested to get your thoughts on, Becca. If someone thinks they might have ADHD, is it worth trying to get a diagnosis? Because it's not the easiest thing to get diagnosed, and it can be expensive as well. Not everyone can access that.
It can be, I think, if you are really struggling, whether that's I can't keep a job or like I'm having issues with my relationships, it's starting to impact, my relationships with people, or like it's just really affecting my overall, mental and physical health. I think if you are looking for more resources to get support, unfortunately, it's like getting the diagnosis kind of opens the gates to more treatment options. There are probably, I would assume, some coaches and people who will work with you even if you don't have a formal diagnosis. But I think it can be really helpful, especially if you want to pursue medication, if that feels like a good option for you or you're curious about it. Or if you want more, like, I'm sure there's probably some therapies and things where they want an actual diagnosis for it. So I think it can be helpful and validating. I have never come across a person who's like, I wish I never got diagnosed. Everyone I know is like, I'm really grateful that I got the diagnosis, and that, there are a lot of barriers, unfortunately. So I think self-diagnosis is completely valid. For me, I work with clients who are like, I don't have the money to get a formal diagnosis, or I live somewhere where like, I know in the UK, if you go through the public healthcare system, it takes about a year to get an evaluation. So paying privately is very expensive. So I'm not going to tell you go get it, wait till you get a diagnosis and come back. So I think it's really important. If you think you have it, that's a totally valid to self-diagnose. I think if you're just looking for more support, that's where the diagnosis can be helpful.
Mhm. Can you say a little bit about medication? Because if I'm correct, ADHD is something that exists on a scale. So some people's symptoms might be more affecting their day-to-day life, and then others might just notice it in certain areas.
Yeah, I think medication can be a great tool. Not everyone needs it. And there's so many more options than there used to be. So there's stimulant medications like Adderall and Vyvanse. And then there's things that are non-stimulant medications. So they don't have as much of like the appetite suppressant side effect and things like that. So some people will choose to go down that route, and it doesn't feel like there's not as big of a difference in terms of how you feel sometimes when you're on the non-stimulant ones. So I think everyone's biochemistry too is different. Some medications work really well for some people. And other people like, that was the worst experience of my life, and I don't want to take that medication ever again. So I think it varies person to person. Personally, I should say I do take medication. And for me, it's a game changer for me to be able to do the things that I want to do in a day. And I used to feel so much shame. I felt like I was like cheating the system because I was taking medication. But I was like, I genuinely need this to make my life easier. And I could probably survive without it. The amount of effort that I would have to put to do simple day-to-day things, keeping my apartment semi-clean or trying to do important things would be 10 times harder. And when I do take, I don't take my medication every day, but if I have a period of time where I don't take it, it's a nice reminder of, oh, I do actually need this medication and it does help me.
Mm.
I've got a friend with ADHD on medication, and she also doesn't take it every day. She doesn't want to take it on holiday
Yeah.
because she says it takes the edge off her emotions sometimes, as she wants to feel those emotions. How would you decide what days it's beneficial for you and what days I'm not going to take it today?
If I have a lot of work things to do, those days when I'm working, I will definitely take my medication. And then it's usually weekend days, or like if I am on a vacation or somewhere where like I want to, I guess, kind of relax a little bit, or just not want to. I was actually sick a little bit ago, and it tried to give me, I collapsed a long side story. I'm okay, a couple weeks ago. And they kept wanting to give me my medication when I was in the hospital. And I was like, all I can do is sit here in this hospital bed right now. I was like, I don't want to take that because I'm going to want to go do things. And I don't have my computer. I can't do it. I can't move around. That's not a time I want to do that. I'm very much the same. I notice it. See, at first, I'm a lot goofier when I'm unmedicated. So like when I'm around my friends and stuff, I enjoy, being goofier and sillier and all of that sort of stuff as well.
What are your go-to sources of dopamine when you're talking about that toolkit?
Yeah. For me, movement is huge. And there's actual research to support that movement does help with getting dopamine and lots of other lovely chemicals that make us happy. And I've always been super active. It makes total sense to me because as a kid, I was always in sports and things like that. So that's a really big one. Listening to music as well, I find really stimulating. The combination of the two, going to concerts is something, obviously I can't do that every day. I'd love to if I could in a dream world, but those are really fun and stimulating for me. Like doing puzzles or little projects or things like that can be really rewarding. Work for me is something that's very stimulating, or just learning new things can be something that's stimulating for me as well. When it comes to food, crunchy food is something that's very stimulating. A lot of my clients find that that's like, of all the food textures, crunchy is probably the one a lot of my clients seek out as a stim. Carbonated water too is like this, basically the sensation of the bubbles. And then if you think about soda, like caffeinated soda is like a kryptonite for ADHD because you get the sugar, the carbonation, and the caffeine is like, woo, light bulbs. That and chocolate, I would say as well for a lot of ADHDers. There's a psychologist, Dr. Hollowell's his name, and he calls chocolate ADHD kryptonite because you get a little bit of caffeine and sugar. So he's like, obviously it's going to make your brain really happy when you have it. So
is it anything that makes you happy will stimulate dopamine? Is that how the system works? That's probably a bit basic, but
yeah, it's a reward system. So anything you find rewarding would be, but yeah, anything that's fun or enjoyable can be like, some people are really into like, ADHDers might be into like more extreme things like sport, like extreme sports and stuff like that because of all the dopamine that you get from it.
Mm.
I have got a couple of questions. I think you've kind of covered them, but someone said, could having a better understanding of how ADHD affects a person help with managing difficulties with food?
Definitely. Yeah. I think that's too, where like, especially if cooking and things like that is really hard for you, understanding what parts of your executive functioning is a challenge for you, then you can start to learn, where can I take shortcuts in the cooking process to make it easier or less overwhelming? Like the grocery store can be just sensory input wise overwhelming for a lot of people, or just all of the choices or trying to remember everything on your list. So maybe it's ordering groceries that's helpful for you, or what I call shortcuts, like convenience foods, like frozen fruits and veggies. Anything in the freezer can be a great, option, because then you don't have to worry about remembering it before it goes bad. Other things like, I use a lot of herb paste and things that just take time out of the cooking process or steps. So that way it doesn't feel like, oh, I need to boil the rice in a pot. And that's one pot I have to clean up. And then I have to make a sheet pan of this. And then I have to cook this on the stove, of like ways to consolidate things so that it's less steps, less dishes, less ingredients and things. And it just makes it easier.
When you were talking about like the chocolate and the crunchy foods and things and how it's such a kryptonite, it also, again, with this lens of understanding, like that's to have compassion for the part of us, especially with the intersection of ADHD and eating disorder, where food is so compelling. It's so rewarding and it's doing a job. And I would,
Yeah.
I don't know what your take on this is. I always think like sometimes food is like, it's going to feel like the best option. It's going to feel like the thing that hits the best. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And that's understandable. It doesn't, like, I think that sometimes we think that's gluttony, or like, why am I so obsessed with food? And it might just be because it's got all those factors. It's got that crunch. It's got the reward. It's for a reason. That's a hard one to break. And maybe even the thought of turning on music takes some steps. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? That's like, it's not going to, food's going to feel like the first line of defense and the easiest. And
Yeah.
that's why it can be such a hard thing to break.
And I think it too can just be, I think the acceptance piece of that, of like, hey, this might be the only thing in the moment that is going to help. And that's okay. And I've even had clients who work with, therapists or psychiatrists who are like, hey, if that's what's going to help you get through your spreadsheet. I remember a client being like, I have to do this spreadsheet every quarter and I always need chocolate to do it. And and I think it was her psychiatrist was like, okay, well, like, that's fine. Like, you're not doing it it's not like you're sitting there eating like a ton of chocolate, or that you're eating it every single day. But like, if that's what's going to help you with that one thing, okay, it's okay to eat for emotional reasons. Like food is not, I think it's, it's not just fuel. It does have, it brings us together. It has so many other things around, not just being fuel for us, and being okay with like, yeah, this can be one of the tools in my toolkit, but just knowing that like, it shouldn't be the only thing I rely on to get stimulation when I need it, or that when I do it, I shouldn't be scrolling on my phone and watching TV and, mindlessly eating it, trying to really be present as present as possible. So then you can, like, maximizing that sensory experience from that food will help you also get more stimulation from it, versus like being completely disconnected and you're like, did I even eat that? Like, I barely remember.
Yeah. That's a super great point. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Why is there a link between like doing a spreadsheet or something? I find this comes up a lot, where the need for that hit or that stim is there during experiences of work. But is there why? Like,
if it's like boring tasks in particular, like, they're just not fun. For some people, a spreadsheet, if it's fun, you're probably powering through the spreadsheet and it's great. But if it's not a task that you're like excited to do, bringing that in kind of gives your brain that like a little bit more executive fuel to get it done. Or if it's something that's hard, like a spreadsheet might be challenging to go back and find, especially if you're not very organized, like going and finding all the numbers or whatever you're looking for in your notes and trying to figure it all out to input all that data in, like can be draining for your brain. So it's just kind of giving your brain some of that.
Okay.
That's
a great explanation.
So yeah, I'll have clients who be like, yeah, if I have this little snack, I can power through my thing and get it done. And if that's what works, awesome.
Yeah.
You've spoken a bit about eating for stimulation and impulsive eating, the idea of eating more and how ADHD might impact that. I wanted to touch on eating less and the restriction element. I know that some medications reduce appetite, and that's part of it. But I also have a few friends with ADHD. I have another friend with ADHD, and we've spoken a little bit about food and body image. And she's always been in a very slim body, and she's recently been diagnosed with ADHD. And she says she feels like her ADHD gave her the capacity to control her food and be very fixated on that. And it felt like the flip side of the same coin. So I just wondered what your thoughts were on that.
That's for me, like when I was younger, it was a hyperfixation to control what I was eating, and almost the reward of being good at like, quote unquote, good at controlling my eating or having this perfect way of eating, or people being like, oh, you're, all of the diet culture, like, oh, you're so good for not needing dessert or this or that. And it was like, all of that was so stimulating to my brain of like, oh, I'm good at this. I'm going to keep doing this kind of thing. So I think there can be that component of it too, with the restriction side of things. I've had some people say that like because you can focus on that piece, the other stuff going on, it kind of quiets the chaos in your brain to have that be like what you can hyperfixate on, because we have to eat so many times a day that it's a really easy thing to kind of put your mind on because it's something we do so frequently.
Thank you. There's one more question from the group. Again, I think you kind of covered it, but I'll sort of read it out because it just mentions it in a slightly different way. So the question is, how can I deal with the impulsive eating, which we touched upon? I often eat out of pure boredom, especially when watching TV. I've already bought myself a fidget cube, and still the keeping myself busy need is so high.
It might not feel like that's enough for you. I would explore other things to add to that list, whether it could be like, I have a lot of clients who will crochet or knit. So that'll give your brain a little bit more to do versus just, playing around with something in your hands, kind of having to think a little bit more, or like a puzzle even, or even like coloring, exploring other things, or even if it means like, I know in the evening it might not be ideal, but maybe if it's like walking and watching TV or doing exercises, or, finding if there's anything else that would help make that activity more fun, because TV unfortunately just isn't very stimulating for ADHD brains. So usually that's a lot of people with ADHD. My partner hates when we watch TV together because I can't sit still. I can't sit still. I'm like, why do you keep getting up to go do things? And I'm like, well, we're watching. I can still listen to the show and go put something away or go do this or go do that. And it drives him nuts. But it's just I just know that, or sometimes he'll just throw me a fidget if I can't sit still and be like, can you please watch the show? Yes. So I know it's really hard, but it might be exploring, hey, maybe watching TV isn't stimulating enough for my brain and I need to find something else to do that. Maybe is a little bit more fulfilling or exciting.
I might edit this question out because I'm not quite sure how it's going to come out yet. It might be a bit clumsy. But is there a possibility, and I don't know because I appreciate this is a neurodivergent issue, not something that perhaps is more malleable, like something that wasn't about how the brain processes something. This constant seeking stimulation, is it possible, instead of feeding the stimulation, to tolerate the need of seeking stimulation and not seek it? Or is that unbearable, intolerable for an ADHD brain to be able to do?
I would say it might feel really intolerable because, like, if you think about like telling a kid who's bouncing around in their chair to stop doing that and just sit and pay attention in class, or someone who's doodling in class when, the teacher's talking and they're like, you're not paying attention. They're like, if I put this pen down, I'm not going to be able to pay attention to you. Like it looks like I'm not, but I am. So I think those would be good examples of like, if you tell someone to stop, then they're sitting there and they're like, I need to do that thing. So I actually can pay attention.
I guess because for me with a non-ADHD brain, if there's a seeking or a craving, there is sometimes the option of sitting and tolerating, and then it goes away. It transforms into something else. And I'm guessing then that with an ADHD brain, the brain can't shift, it can't downregulate, it can't do that.
Maybe, I'm not sure completely, to be honest, but I feel like if it's, especially with food, if it's like an actual craving, like I had someone ask me about this the other day and I was like, if it's a real craving, your brain, maybe you can let the craving pass. But if it is looking for that sensory input, you're probably going to keep continuing to seek it out in some way, shape, or form.
I would imagine that it feels like energy in the body, that like energy doesn't just go away. It just translates somewhere else. And like that, it's like you don't shut it off. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah.
Another place I see people's frustrations show up is in partners or family members of people who have ADHD.
Yes.
And that idea of what is it? Like, where's the line of responsibility?
Yeah.
Like an ADHD, some certain types of ADHD anyway, to be able to plan or to anticipate things that need doing, for example, isn't going to happen.
Yeah. I think it's really helpful to have people who are open or willing to be open and learning and understanding how ADHD shows up in that, in your loved one's life, and how you can support them and how they can support you. Like if it's like, hey, I really forget, it's not that I don't want to, if my job is to sweep the floors and I don't remember, there might need to be, a chart on our fridge of the tasks that we need to do and what day I need to do it. So that way I have that accountability there. So sometimes it's just kind of like learning how to navigate, like, hey, I'm really good at this thing. So maybe I should, focus on strengths. A lot of times too, is what a lot of ADHD coaches will tell people, like focus on what your strengths are. And then you guys can kind of, with your partner or your family, figure out how you guys can all kind of manage things together. So you can still, be supportive and they could still do what they need to do and be included too.
What advice would you give to other professionals, particularly in the disordered eating realm, when we're working with clients with ADHD?
I think knowing, for a lot of my clients, it's not a lack of knowledge. It's how to do things in a way that works for them. I have a lot of clients who will work with, especially like other dietitians or nutritionists, and they'll just be like, give them a list of foods to eat. And they're like, cool, this is literally not helpful at all because I don't know how to do that. Or they'll give them a recipe that has, 20 ingredients and takes an hour to make. And they're like, this isn't doable for me. Like that's too much. So I think understanding that like how is usually where a lot of clients will struggle. And so trying to help them figure out how to do the things that they want to do or that are supportive for their recovery can be really helpful. And that they're not being non-compliant or that they don't want, it's not that they don't want to recover. I have a lot of clients will be like, I can't follow the meal plan that I have. And it's not that I don't want to, I don't know how to, I can't cook this many times a day. It's too exhausting or overwhelming. So I think knowing that if there's something there, or if someone's not tracking food, if that's something you've asked them to do, for some people, that's just one extra step to eating that they're like, eating's already hard enough. And you're going to ask me to go sit and write everything out that I just ate. Like that's unreal. Like that's not happening. Not in a million years. So like, I think understanding that piece too, it's not like, oh, they're just being lazy or they don't care or they don't really want to recover. It's usually more related to their ADHD.
And I'm thinking now of the people pleasing aspect that you talk about. When you're used to masking and people pleasing, you could be working with a professional and trying to be as compliant as you.
Yeah.
For me, like I'm all about in my work anyway, like trying to give the client autonomy, letting them choose and make decisions and be very much a part of the decision-making process as well, which just seems like it's just good manners.
Regardless, I think in order to have a better relationship with food or to, to work on your recovery, I think you should have them be the one in the driver's seat, even in like intuitive eating, giving you the skills to be able to eat in a way that works for you, and being able to feel comfortable that I can do this. I don't need someone else to constantly be telling me what to eat or how much to eat, or, being able to develop those skills. It's always like, I have people like, can you make a meal plan? And it's like, I can't make you a meal plan because you're going to eat this week or 2 weeks of food the rest of your life. Like, I want to give you the skills to be able to meal plan in a way that works for you. And how can we work together so that you can meal plan in a way that works for you, because it's not going to be the same for someone else that I work with, what skills are helpful.
So where can people find you and learn more about you and learn to work with you? And
I'm most active on Instagram, so you can find me at ADHD.nutritionist. And if you are interested in working with me, I have a link in my bio for a free call to kind of learn about my coaching programs and see if we're a good fit to work together. So
we'll include that link in show notes.
Thank you so much, Becca, for joining us today and for sharing all your wisdom. It's really appreciated. I've learned a lot. I appreciate
It'd be really helpful
giving us your time. So thank you, Becca.
thank you guys so much for having me.